Imagine if someone saved you from a scary attacker and then offered to walk you home. Surely, you'd see them as a total hero, right? Well, in this famous and upsetting case from the 1980s, a pretty Japanese teenager with a bright future at first believed that a white knight had rescued her from a very scary person. Unfortunately, her rescuer was someone truly nightmarish, and she'd spend the next 44 days at the mercy of a huge group of complete monsters. So, here's what happened. Now, you might be more familiar with Japan as the home of delicious ramen, lost in translation, samurai, and Pokemon. But like anywhere else, it has a really dark side too. And nothing shows that better than this extremely shocking case. On January 23rd, 1989, the police of Misato in Japan had picked up two despicable teenagers for questioning. Hiroshi Miyano and Joe Agura had allegedly violated a woman in her late teens. And they were now even more suspicious because the cops had found women's underwear at their homes. The investigators also wanted to know if Hiroshi was connected to a double homicide of a woman and her little son. But Hiroshi thought that the cops were accusing him of something else entirely. He also thought that Joe had confessed about this, so he told the cops where to find a body that was in Tokyo. The cops traveled to Tokyo to see if this claim was true, but what they discovered there in a big drum container filled with concrete would shock everybody for a long time to come. It was the body of a missing teenager, and she was the last person anyone would expect to be mixed up with a total creep like Hiroshi. Junko Furuta was almost too good to be true. As a middle child with two brothers, she worked hard at school and kept up excellent grades. She didn't drink and always refused drugs. She had a pretty great job lined up for when she left school, at a plastics molding factory, where she already worked in the evenings. She was also very pretty, but she just wasn't interested in any of the attention caused by her attractiveness. Different sources suggest that this led to Hiroshi, who apparently went to the same school as Junko and tried to ask her out. And when he was rejected, well, it wasn't good. The trouble is, some guys really don't like to be told no, and Hiroshi took Junko's rejection very personally. So this has been called a possible reason behind everything that happened to Junko next. But Hiroshi already had a really horrible reputation. There was a very good reason why the cops picked him up in 1989. He was already a disgusting person then, and the people he hung out with were just as bad. But what he and his friends ended up doing to poor Junko definitely made them into monsters. On November 25th, 1988, Junko was innocently riding her bike along some back streets after a day at high school when a total weirdo kicked her over. Just as things looked bad for her, Hiroshi Miyano appeared and seemed to rescue her. Once Hiroshi appeared, the weirdo immediately ran away, and Hiroshi offered to walk Junko home, to make sure she was safe on those back streets, but that would be the last time anyone ever saw her alive. Because this weirdo was actually Minato, one of Hiroshi's 3 friends. They hung out as a gang, and colliding with Junko's bike was all part of a sick trap to capture her. What they did to her next was unbelievably horrifying. By November 27th, 1988, Junko's mom and dad were incredibly worried about their responsible, reliable daughter. They must have been even more shocked when they received a phone call from her, and she told them that she had run away. She was staying with friends and not to worry. Junko insisted that they stop the police from looking for her. Even though I think that sounds really out of character, her parents did what she said, and the police also dropped the search for her. But of course, the truth behind that phone call was so much worse, because Junko had been kidnapped by 4 totally evil men. You probably have a pretty good idea about what they would have wanted her for. As Hiroshi had walked her home, he in fact led her to a disused warehouse. He told her not to fight back because he was part part of the Japanese gang called the Yakuza. Now, he and his friends were involved with Yakuza, but only as very low-ranking Chinpira. Even so, they were being scary enough to terrify poor Yunko into doing whatever they wanted. They also threatened to hurt her family if she didn't obey them. At first, Hiroshi had done awful things to her in that warehouse where he'd led her. And then, in a hotel close by, he'd called a friend to visit and even boasted about what he was doing. Hiroshi and his Chinpara buddies had already had a disgusting habit of frequently kidnapping and violating random women together. Eventually, Hiroshi forced Yunko to come to an apartment belonging to his buddy Shinshi Minata's parents. Those parents would actually drop by and visit their equally terrifying son. Even though his mom and dad clearly saw what was happening to poor Yunko, they never dared to lift a finger to help. In some ways, I really can't blame them. The four guys were absolutely brutal and seemed to have no empathy or humanity whatsoever. They began to bring other gangsters to see and use poor Yunko, sometimes as many as 12 a day. But although that was bad enough, it was what else they began to do to her constantly, all day long, that makes this case the most horrifying. They used weird objects on her. They did things that were so inhuman that it doesn't seem physically possible for anyone to inflict it on another person. And the situation only got worse for her each day. A film from 2004 called Concrete is closely based on Fertura's horrible experience and graphically shows what she went through. So if you're curious for more details, that's one place to look. There are also at least 3 books about this case, and a manga adaptation called 17 Sai, which is loosely based on Yunko's story. But I can say that these monsters forced Yunko to eat live cockroaches, starved her, eventually only giving her a little milk to survive on. She was made to inhale lighter fluid, smoke lots of cigarettes at once, and the men used worse and worse objects to inflict complete agony. They constantly humiliated her too, and I can't even begin to understand how they could do any of it. It's so incredibly sick. Those visits from other twisted gang members continued to happen until she became too disfigured for even them to stand looking at her. She was slowly becoming destroyed, but somehow Yunko just kept on living. Although she probably knew she couldn't survive this treatment for much longer, she probably understood that she had to make a break for it and escape. And at one point, she had exactly that chance, if she could be brave enough. On the 20th day since they'd taken Yunko off the streets, the 4 sickos were in a drunken stupor at Minato's apartment after a long night of drinking and partying. For a little while, those monsters had no idea what was going on, and nobody was keeping watch on her. Despite how horribly injured she already was, Yunko bravely seized that one chance to get help and escape. With what must have been a lot of effort and courage, Yunko was able to get to a phone. She immediately tried to call the police. Unfortunately, one of those inhumane sickos must have woken up at the worst moment. He stopped Yunko before she could finish making that vital call. And of course, she was even more badly punished for trying to do that. Injuries, including those inflicted by setting lighter fluid on fire, meant she could barely walk anymore and had to crawl around the apartment. For the next 20 days, Yunko just kept getting weaker and weaker. Soon, she could barely walk or move, and the constant injuries were making her body shut down altogether. Because of her brutal internal injuries, she couldn't even eat without throwing up. The sickos also made her sleep out on the balcony in the middle of winter. Frankly, it's amazing she survived as long as she actually did. As it seemed unlikely they'd ever free her, and her health got worse and worse, she would demand that they simply end it or get it over with, but she wouldn't be released from her torment until she did something pretty remarkable. On January 4th, 1998, these monsters challenged her to a game of Mahjong Solitaire, and Yunko completely beat them at it. Think about that! Despite all of the horrible injuries, violations, and trauma, despite everything she had been put through, she was still smart enough to defeat them. I mean, it could have been a total trick on their part, but she still won, which they weren't happy about at all. That victory, though satisfying, just led to 2 hours of very intense pain and unimaginable torture. I can't even get into it here, it's so bad. By the time they'd finished hurting her, she was far too gone to even react to the pain. At the end, they used heavy dumbbells to hurt her until she stopped moving entirely. While it was a final escape from the agony for her, it completely panicked the 4 evil freaks. See, even the Yakuza aren't totally safe from the cops, and these losers were only on the lowest level. Now, they had a very incriminating body to deal with, and I mean, I'm not sure what they'd expected to happen to her after all that tormenting, you know? They really weren't too bright, but they definitely were cruel, sadistic, and in serious need of suffering some consequences. So now desperate to hide the evidence, after 24 hours they hid poor Yunko's lifeless body inside a 55-gallon oil drum. Then they filled it with wet concrete. They disposed of this in Kodo City, near Tokyo. And as you know from earlier in the video, that's exactly where the police found her. They would retrieve Yunko and return her home in January 1989. But could law enforcement ever prove who was behind this horrific discovery? While the authorities figured out how to make a case against the 4 monsters, Yunko's friends, family, and classmates were trying to come to terms with her unbearable last hours alive. In total, she'd suffered for between 40 and 44 days at the hands of Hiroshi and his friends. At Yunko's funeral, one school friend wrote, "You must have been in so much pain, so much suffering. We will never forget you. Young-chan, there is no more pain, no more suffering. Please rest in peace." She was buried in a happy coat, which is kind of a traditional Japanese robe. It had been designed by her classmates. The factory where she would have worked also donated an honorary uniform as a tribute, and Yunko's high school presented her graduation certificate to her grieving parents. Nothing could make up for what had happened to her, but surely the courts would make sure that Yunko's disgusting tormentors would be behind bars for a long time. Now, the 4 attackers had underestimated just how much evidence was left on and around Yunko's body, and in that drum full of concrete. The police were eventually able to build a very convincing case against them. Because the 4 men were minors at the time of their crime, they weren't supposed to be named in the media. But one magazine was so outraged by their actions that their names were widely released. The whole of Japan was distraught about what had been done to Yunko. And for this kind of horrendous crime, you'd think that the judge would throw the book at all of them. A really, really big book. But don't hold your breath. At the trial, the 4 monsters only pled guilty to committing bodily injury that resulted in death. I think it was a lot worse than that. In July 1990, Hiroshi Miyano received the longest sentence, 17 years in prison. Miyano's mom also had to sell the family home to pay a huge amount of compensation to Yunko's family. Nobuharu Minato, who lived at the apartment where all of this horror happened, only got handed 5 to 9 years. And his parents weren't even charged for ignoring what their son was doing. Yasushi Watanabe had his sentence raised from 5 to 7 years. And finally, Joe Agura served 8 years. Their sentences were all really light considering what they'd done, but none of them stayed out of prison for very long, even after they were released, because they're still completely horrible people. And whenever they changed their names, they'd still be doxxed by the public. And just consider, what they did to Yunko was so bad that one of the jurors at the trial fainted during the reports. Even the judge was afraid that her spirit would still wander lost after she'd gone through so much awful torment. I really hope that part isn't true. I just hope that Yunko Furuta finally found some peace in the end. This reminds me so much of another super disturbing case we've covered, which was also from Japan. That one was from the late 1990s, known as the Hello Kitty case. It was every bit as disturbing as this one, and in some ways, even weirder. Why was the court so easy on such total monsters? Let me know what you think in the comments below.